Back. Welcome back to the 2020 First Amendment Congress. I'm Andy Moore. I'm the Executive Director of Freedom of Information Oklahoma. We're so glad you're here. This is our final session of today, and it addresses the theme of flexing your rights in a different way, your voting rights. So I know the election's over, but man, what a doozy. And this one has brought up a whole host of issues that many Americans did not fully appreciate or anticipate. And, one cool thing about our democracy is that as soon as one election is over, preparation and efforts towards the next one are already beginning. And to prove that point, here in Oklahoma City, this week is candidate filing for Oklahoma City Council, I think some school board seats, and a state Senate seat that was recently left open by the election of Congresswoman-elect Stephanie Bice. So the democracy train keeps on rolling. And those are just the ones I'm aware of. I'm sure there's a bunch more throughout the state. So for this, our final session of the day, we are going to discuss the importance of voting, the mechanics of casting a ballot by mail or in person, making a plan to vote, and becoming an engaged voter in all the ways. To guide our discussion, I'm going to turn it over to FOI Oklahoma board member Laura Akers, and she is actually the chair of the committee that organized this whole event today. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Andy. It is wonderful to be here, and I'm excited to speak with the three individuals I'm about to introduce. They are truly experts and have the knowledge around elections and voting, as well as being an engaged citizen in the state of Oklahoma. So first, today, we've got Brian Dean. He's from the ACLU of Oklahoma's Voter Protection Program. Also, Brian served for many years with the Oklahoma State Election Board, so he has much information and knowledge coming from working in state government around elections. Next, we have Roxanne Logan, who is the Southeastern Oklahoma field organizer for Together Oklahoma. She's based in Ardmore, and she also is involved with the League of Women Voters. And then last, we have Angela Munson, who is the Outreach and Legislative Director for Oklahoma Policy Institute. But it is important to know that Angela Munson is also the former State Senator Munson and has served in our state legislature and has had many roles being involved in the state of Oklahoma. So with that, we'll go ahead and just get started. And with talking about elections and voting, I thought it might be a good idea to kind of start at the beginning. We have many individuals in the audience today that are first-time voters in 2020, or perhaps will be first-time voters in 2021 or 2022. So who can vote in the United States? We know that when George Washington was elected America's first president, only 6% of the country was allowed to vote. So we have made significant strides since then as far as who can vote in the United States. But Brian, perhaps let's hear from you and introduce to us, how old you have to be. Do you have to be an American citizen? I mean, what are really the key things to keep in mind for who can vote in the United States?
Right, well, you have to be 18 years old, and you have to be a U.S. citizen. And we also have rules around, for example, if you are convicted of a felony, you have to have served out the time of your original sentence before you can re-register to vote. If you've been adjudged incapacitated mentally by a court, then you're also not eligible. So yeah, we have a few rules there, and there are some others about when maybe that franchise gets taken away.
Okay. All right. So what does it take to register to vote? How can someone actually say, I'm going to vote in the next election, but how do I do that? How do I even step up and make sure that I am ready to vote on election day? Roxanne, do you want to kick that one off for us?
Yes, you can. To register to vote, you can always go to your county election board and register there. As of today, the Oklahoma State Election Board does not have where you can automatically register online. they do have a window where you can register, complete the application, but then you have to print it out, sign it, and mail it back in. And most any time, I know specifically here in Ardmore, we are constantly having voter registration events. And a lot of times I will try to get to the schools and go to the senior classes and register students there, because any student that's 17 and a half that will turn 18 before the election day can register to vote. So most every senior is eligible to register to vote.
That's a really important point, and something if I've heard that before, it just kind of went in the back of my mind. But that is really important because, yeah, say I am turning 18 next week and I want to make sure I'm eligible to vote in that January election, the ones that are Andy Moore was talking about. So you don't have to wait until you actually turn 18. You can go ahead and do paperwork and get started. So in Oklahoma, can you register to vote on the day of the election? Is that a possibility? Sometimes when you're watching national news, you might hear references to other states and how they do it. I'm seeing shaking of heads. Angela, you want to touch on this one?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad to be here today. No, you cannot. Unfortunately, Oklahoma is not a same day registration state. And I just wanted to add to Roxanne's comments too. You can register at a tag agency. So young people who are like my kid who didn't get her driver's license till she was almost 18, you can do two things at once. State agencies like DHS county offices and some county health departments also offer opportunities to register. So many of the public agencies will have registration forms and information there routinely. No, this is not a same day registration state. Maybe one of these days. There are a lot of logistical kinds of things. Some states are. Around in the US and in many other countries, same day registration. In some countries, registration is even required to get a driver's license or to even buy a house, believe it or not.
So why vote? For each of us, we might have a different answer for that, something that really speaks to maybe what we're involved in or what issues were important to us. But let's start with you, Brian. Why do you vote? What's a reason that brings you to the polls every time? Oh, I think we are having some technical difficulties.
Sorry, I got you there.
Okay.
So one of the things I've always said to people when they ask about this is that voting is the only thing that's asked of us as citizens. And when you talk about patriotism, and there's a lot of talk about patriotism and displays of patriotism, if you want to show me you're a patriot, vote. Vote in every election. Vote in local elections. Vote in school board races. That is how you show as an American that you are a good citizen. It's not just about waving a flag or singing an anthem or, standing and covering your heart or what have you. Voting is really the only thing that our country asks of us to be citizens. And so for me, it's above all, it's our duty as citizens to vote. And there's obviously a multitude of other reasons, and I'll let some of the other panelists speak to that if they wish. But to me, it's just that obligation we have to show that we care about being an American.
Wonderful. Roxanne, how about you? What causes you to vote each time?
Well, I am a Cherokee Indian. And even though the Native Americans were here and owned this country and still own this country, they were not even recognized as citizens until 1924. And in most states, they were not even given the right to vote until 1957. And so I vote for all of those who were not allowed to vote, who were not even recognized as citizens. And I think it's my personal responsibility to vote. I think it's everyone's personal responsibility to vote. And I like being able to hold the people that I help elect accountable. when they're out campaigning for the office, whatever it might be, they're making all these promises. So after they're elected, I like to be able to make sure they stand up to everything they promised us they were going to do.
All right. And Angela, what about you?
Well, I vote because this form of government we have in this country called representative democracy is totally dependent upon citizens' participation in the process. And that participation fundamentally is through voting. Number one step. There are a lot of other steps to participate, but voting is certainly fundamental to that process. You know, we send people to the state capitol, we send people to school board, city council, to Congress, we vote for a president. We have all these opportunities to elect people to speak for us. So when people are elected to office, we want them to voice what we feel, what we think, what we believe to be true, and what we think to be beneficial to all of the people in our families, communities, whatever. And the only way we can do that is to collectively act. And that, you know, one vote does matter. One vote sometimes determines the outcome of a race, but all these votes collectively choose who's going to speak for us. And I want the person speaking for me to really voice my beliefs and my thoughts. We don't always agree, so I don't expect them to do that 100% of the time. And as a former elected official, I know how hard that is. You represent, you know, some 70, 80,000 people. They don't always agree. So we as elected representatives have a responsibility to hear and to listen. And I want, as a voter, whomever is elected to represent me, to listen. I'm gonna tell a funny quick story. When I was first elected to office, I used to keep the hard copies of the poll books where people sign in and shows that they're voting. Now, this was way before we can talk about mail-in ballots and some early voting opportunities, but it was before then. So I'd keep this in my desk drawer. Whenever a constituent would call, you know, it's pretty anal like this, I'd pull it out and see if they voted in the last election. Not that I wouldn't provide the same good constituency services, but it's important to know, and you just never know who might be checking.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I'm hearing some wonderful answers for why all three of you choose to vote. But something that I heard was from Roxanne, the accountability factor, and then also from Angela, kind of holding public officials responsible, that they are to be your voice in that office. So it's important to vote, but it's just as important to be ready to cast that ballot. And what I mean there is having done your research, walking in on to the ballot box, knowing what questions are before you and about the issues as well as the candidates. So for the three of you, I'd like to hear maybe from your perspective, what are ways that a voter can educate themselves on the issues and the candidates before they walk into that ballot box or fill out their ballot to mail in? Brian, let's start with you.
Well, I think step one would be to try to get a sample ballot. And thankfully, it's a lot easier to do that now than it used to be. You'd have to hope maybe your local paper was going to print it in the newspaper. You'd have to go down and get a copy of the sample ballot at your county election board. You could still do that, but thanks to the internet, the state election board now offers a portal on its website for voters where you can enter your name and your date of birth, and it will pull up your registration, and you can just click a button and pull up a PDF of your sample ballot, and that will show you everyone on your ballot. It'll show you every race, show you every initiative. It'll show you the exact language that's on any propositions that are on there, which I think often get overlooked, especially the local propositions. I think that's something that people often don't think about, but that's going to determine school funding. It's going to determine various tax proposals and things of that nature for local and state government. And I think that's really just step one. And then step two is to seek out other sources. And there have been some efforts. Used to be that newspapers, and I was a newspaper reporter for a long time, it used to be that newspapers would do voter guides and things like that. They don't have the money and the space to do that anymore because of what's happened with the industry. So there have been some efforts by other groups, including the League of Women Voters, to try to put together some voter guides. So it's always a good idea to seek those out as well.
Wonderful. And we'll go with Roxanne next because she's very involved in the League of Women Voters and what you referenced, Brian, the voter guide. I can speak from an Oklahoma citizen who's viewed the last two ones that the League of Women Voters and other groups have worked towards publishing, and they're very informative, nonpartisan information. So let's hear from you, Roxanne. Perhaps you could touch on that and also explain from your point of view, what are some ways to educate yourself before casting that ballot?
Well, like you mentioned, the voter's guide that the League of Women Voters puts out, they do a lot of background research on everything that's going to be on the ballot. They do a lot of the research for you. So about the candidates, about their voting records, if there's any questions on there, if there's any judges on there, which a lot of time the judges are hard to find information on. But if there's Google, there's speaking to people that you know are knowledgeable and that you respect them, and you know that they are going to be able to share information with you that's going to help you understand. A lot of the questions, the way they're written, it's like they purposely make them where you can't really understand what they're trying to get across. So it is incumbent upon you to do a lot of your own research, sadly. Every time a candidate comes within driving distance that you feel comfortable with, if you want to understand what they're saying, go to their town halls, go to any public meeting that they are putting on, ask them questions. That's what they're there for. They want to hear from you. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there's a lot of different avenues for you to gain information. So it's pretty open.
All right, Angela, do you have anything to add? Any tips?
Yeah, I think all those tips are great and right on point. To getting that sample ballot is really, really important. It is much easier than it used to be. There's also some national sources. Ballotpedia is a source that you can look up issues and candidates. And I think those who are listening and watching ought to realize that maybe the search or the information search is a bit different from a candidate. If you're voting on a candidate or voting on an issue, and sources may be a bit different. Roxanne hit it. You know, if you feel comfortable now, COVID days, it's hard to go see a candidate, but everybody's got a website. Pull up that website, look at that information, compare if it's an incumbent, there's going to be a voting record. So if you're interested in how this person voted in the past, you know, just Google Oklahoma State Senate or Oklahoma City Council and look at the ordinances or the statutes or the bills that members had to vote on. See how that person voted. So past history is really, really important. They always talk about an incumbent record, having a record. Google the person. If nothing else, just Google a person and see what pops up. You'd be surprised what information you get. But let me quickly say, particularly to young persons, consider the source of the information. The League does a great job putting great, objective, unbiased information out. But when you look at Instagram or even Facebook or some of the other social media sources I'm not even familiar with, really think about the source of the information that you're reading or that you're looking at. Because sometimes it's not factual. Sometimes we know about the bots and all the stuff that's happening out there in the world. Sometimes the information you're getting may not even be from a source in the whole United States. So be aware, young people, before you decide that what you read or what you see is true. Use legitimate sources. League of Women Voters is good. Candidates' websites, state government, city council, local school board sites that give you information about candidates and about initiatives. I wanted to quickly say those state questions are supposed to be written at 6th grade reading level. And Roxanne is absolutely correct. sometimes it can be rather confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can I just piggyback on what Senator Monson just said, which is that I want to just put an emphasis on the importance of considering the source. There's a term for that we call, and I know this is as a former newspaper journalist and someone who majored in journalism, media literacy is the term. And we could do an entire conference on media literacy. It has become a crucial issue because of the spread of social media and of just internet sources. And we've seen this with political news. It has become an absolute cesspool online of propaganda efforts and things like that. So you've got to be able to determine what makes a good source, what makes an independent source. Like when we talk about the League of Women Voters, they don't take sides. If you're going to some site that is, specifically tailored to present news to conservatives or liberals, it's not going to have that same flavor. It's going to give you a slightly twisted version of the facts. And so it's just crucially important, especially for young people. And I do think young people are savvy about this. And sometimes it's some of us older folks who don't do as good a job at considering sources and recognizing good sources. But that is so important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great point. So let's talk about actual voting. 2020 has been an interesting election year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so prior to the presidential election, we heard a lot of candidates as well as groups across the country talking about making a plan to vote, that this was really the election year to plan out how you were going to vote. And what they were referring to was maybe you vote in person on the day of the election, maybe you vote early at your county election office, or maybe you vote by mail. So what are we talking about when what are the different opportunities for Oklahomans to vote? We know about the in-person voting, but what are some of the other options? Brian, you want to lead us with that one?
Yeah, and it's I'm glad you mentioned that. One of the things I did is kind of my last year at the state election board was try to launch an online page where people could make a plan to vote, because the studies have shown that if you do that, you are much more likely to vote. And so that's one of the things I tried to do. And I wasn't able to do everything I wanted to do with it, but that starts with, again, what we said about going and getting that sample ballot, and looking up your polling location if you're going to vote in person, all those sorts of things. But again, you have options. And so the first one, obviously, as we mentioned, is voting in person on election day at your polling location. Another option is to vote early. And that is done in Oklahoma the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday before the election. Thursday and Friday, I believe it's 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then on Saturday, it's I think 10 to 2. And that's for statewide elections. It's for non-statewide elections, it's only on the Thursday and Friday. But for statewide elections, including federal elections, it'd be Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And you can do that at your county election board, or you can do it for larger elections. The larger counties are allowed to have secondary voting sites, and they have done that, for example, like for presidential elections and for gubernatorial elections. They generally have a second site, and you can always go to the state election board's website, and they'll tell you where those sites are going to be. It'll also give you a map to your polling place. That same tool you can use to look up your sample ballot will give you a map to your polling place, and just confirm what precinct you're registered in. So it's just crucially important, again, before you go vote, you just check that voter portal just to make sure, A, am I registered? Hopefully it didn't get expired or something. And then B, getting that sample ballot, and then C, being able to know where you're going to go and vote.
So talk to me about the difference between absentee voting and voting by mail. Those were terms we heard a lot with this past election season. Who can touch on the differences there? Brian, perhaps you again.
Yeah, I forgot to mention the third option, which is voting by mail. And that's another thing. One of the first things I did when I got to the election board was launch an entire page and a media campaign to encourage vote by mail. And the slogan I came up with for that was skip the line, vote by mail. I voted absentee. I voted by mail. And in the election board, when they talk about absentee, there's absentee in person, which is the early voting, and then there's absentee mail, which is voting by mail. Voting by mail is so easy. You can go on to the state election board's website, and you can register online to vote by mail. You can choose to have all of your ballots for an entire year sent to your home. And the great thing about that is then you never forget about an election, because the ballot shows up in your mailbox. One of the things I think people struggle with sometimes in some of those more local elections, turnout tends to be really low. And one of the barriers there is that people just don't know there's an election sometimes. And so one of the great things about voting by mail is ballot shows up, and you have it's going to show up usually about a month before the election. So you've got plenty of time to research the candidates. And then you have a couple of options now. Normally, for most voters, you'd have to get your ballot notarized. You put it in an envelope, and then you have a notary public notarize that. You can do that at most banks and places like that. Because of COVID, there's been an alternate way of doing that this year, which is to send a photocopy of your ID back. But then for disabled voters, if you are physically incapacitated, they're actually allowed to have 2 witnesses sign their ballot. It's very important you do that, because they can't count it unless you follow those procedures. But absentee mail voting, I'm a big fan of it. Most of the election board personnel voted by mail because we were working on election day. Polls open and polls closed. It wasn't real easy for us to get away. So most of us do it. It will get counted. A lot of people are worried, will my mail ballot get counted? They all get counted. There's not, there's rumors about, they only count them if it's close. That's not true. All voted mail-in ballots are counted. So it's just a great way to vote. And I totally encourage people to check into that.
And if I can add, Laura, because I always request an absentee ballot. So don't get confused. Brian was absolutely right. Absentee balloting and voting by mail in Oklahoma are pretty much synonymous. But just perhaps you get your ballot and you forget to fill it out, or you're nervous that the mail may not get it there on time, or you can't drop it off at the county election board, which is a great option. I dropped mine off this year on my way out of town. So if that were to happen, young voters, and you thought, it's election day and I forgot to turn my ballot, you can still go show up. You'll have to do a little extra work, but you can still vote. So don't lose your right. Don't forget. Don't say I can't. No excuses allowed nowadays. Make sure you do go and show up. And there's so many. I hope we can get to some questions about the potential of losing one's right to vote. When I listened to Brian, when he described the days that we can go vote, I had the good fortune, I spent a couple of years in the House of Representatives before I moved to the Senate. And then former Senator Vicki Miles LaGrange, who became a federal judge, was my senator. We co-authored actually the first early voting bill. And that first bill had a whole lot more days on it than we have right now. So what we started with some almost, I hate to say, 30 years ago, 1990 or so, 1991, that allowed more than just these 3 days or so, which allowed 5 or 6 days and should have been more, has shrunk over years. So we don't want to lose any more days. We don't want to lose or create impediments or allow elected officials to create impediments to our right to vote.
Yeah, I really like what Angela just added to the conversation, because if you do pay attention to national news stories, you may have heard at the end of September or in October that some states had started voting for the presidential election. And what she's referring to is those states have early voting that begins weeks and maybe even months prior to the actual election day. And I know our neighbor Kansas definitely starts early voting before we do, because I previously lived in the Panhandle where I had friends in Liberal and Guyman. And so we were voting. Our Kansas folks got to vote like a whole week early compared to us in the Panhandle. But yeah, let's move on to perhaps just some things to keep in mind about voting voting, straight party voting or straight ticket voting. That might be something, if you haven't viewed your sample ballot before and you go in, that might be the first question that might throw you for a loop. So Roxanne, what can you tell us about that?
Well, personally, I do not like straight ticket voting. To me, it creates uninformed voters. It's too easy to just go in and mark the box at the top of your ballot, either Democrat or Republican, and really ignore everything that's on the ballot. And when you do that, if there are state questions on there, you don't get to vote for them unless you specifically go down and mark them. If there's judges on there, because judges are only retain or don't retain, you don't get to vote on them. And then something that a lot of people don't know is, even if you go in and you mark the party box at the top, say you want to vote Republican, but then there is a Democrat candidate that you really, really like. You can go down and mark just that one candidate, and the vote for that single Democrat will count for them, and all the rest of your votes will be Republican candidates.
Good. That's some good information for people to have. This is something that's kind of been popular in more recent years, and we'll have Brian touch on this, but some people like to take selfies with their ballots. They really like to push or, share with their family and friends, I did it, I voted. And some people do that with their election sticker, but other people may like to do it with their ballot. So can you take a selfie at the election booth with your ballot? Brian, is that something that we can do in Oklahoma?
Yes, you can. And let me tell you something. It was a load off my shoulders when they allowed people to do that, because one of the things that we had to deal with when I was at state election board, and I always had to talk to media about this and everything, because people would take those ballot selfies. And just a few years ago, our law was a little ambiguous on what was allowed, because it was written in the 1970s, there was nothing in there. There were specific there's specific laws in there that don't require people to take pictures of marked ballots, and there's a line in there saying that you won't show your marked ballot to anyone, and that could be interpreted to say don't take a picture with your ballot. And though nobody was necessarily going to prosecute people for that, we had to advise folks, just take a picture of yourself, but don't show, who you voted for. Well, thankfully, because that became such an issue year to year, the legislature did take that up. And after a couple of hiccups, it got passed and signed into law. So thankfully now we do not have to worry about ballot selfies anymore. It is legal to take a ballot selfie if you choose to do so. Make sure, though, if you are going to take a picture of yourself at the polling location, you still need to be careful about taking a picture of others, particularly if you're going to take a picture around ballots. You cannot take a picture of somebody else's marked ballot. So I would always recommend doing that, discreetly in the voting booth if you have to. But just be careful about that, because there are still some rules about photography in a polling location.
So watch your background, look at the full picture. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd like to talk about voter suppression, because that's some topic that we hear in the news, about the possibility of voter suppression, or there may be individuals that say that obviously they don't want to see voter suppression. So first, maybe how would you describe voter suppression? What are ways that people may try to suppress somebody from the right to vote? Angela, you want to touch on this first?
I certainly do, because this is a major issue for me. Voter suppression is alive and well in this country. Roxanne talked about the unwillingness to give natives the right to vote, people who are indigenous to this country, the right to vote. Same with women, same with African Americans. So we have had to fight for decades and decades, generations and generations, for this right. And some people still don't think every person is entitled to a vote. In 2002, so that's a long time ago, I was on a panel with an individual who at that time was lieutenant governor of the state of Nevada. And the panel was just like this, about voting and voting rights. And he made the comment very earnestly, very seriously, that he thought we made it too easy for people to vote in this country. And in fact, he said, we should ask people questions like, who's your lieutenant governor? Or who's your congressional district representative before we allow them to vote? And the panel was coming to a close, and I quickly said, and I guess we should ask people how many bubbles there are in a bar of soap, or how many grains of sand there are on a beach, which were real poll questions asked of Black folk before we truly got the right to vote. So the desire to suppress certain groups of people from voting or accessing the ballot is real in this country. And it can be done by closing, in some states, closing polling places, in Oklahoma too. So you may have to drive a long way to get to a polling place, or moving a polling place so it's not on a bus route. It could be things like reducing the days that we have to go early vote, or actually making it harder to register to vote. So there are lots and lots of little bitty things that happen, unfortunately, across the country. Many are much more blatant, like a county in Texas that's closed the single polling place, moved it outside of the county, about 20 to 25 miles away, not on a bus route. And it was an area that had primarily Latinx voters. So, just be aware. And the only way that we can avoid voter suppression, legalized, structured, systemic voter suppression, is to vote. Is to go and vote and make sure that the people who we represent value this right, and that we as citizens value this responsibility.
Would anybody like to add anything on the topic of voter suppression?
Yes, I think it's important to note that voter suppression is, some of those traditional ways are still around, but what's really disturbing is we've seen some new ways that they've tried to go and suppress the vote. And this is something I had to deal with at the election board quite a lot, just in the last couple of elections, which is we have now foreign countries that are actually going through social media, putting out misinformation, trying to divide people, using bot accounts to post things that aren't true. And a lot of times this is aimed at making people stay home. I'm telling them, hey, there's no point in going to vote because the election's rigged. Or telling them, that, the polls are open till 6 o'clock when they're open to 7. All those sorts of things have become a much bigger issue now. And one of the things we had to do at the election board, we were working with social media to try to identify the social media companies, Twitter and Facebook. They've been going through and trying to identify some of these bot accounts. They've taken down accounts run by Russia, run by Iran, run by North Korea in some cases. And so it has become, and there's also some folks that are not affiliated necessarily with a foreign intelligence agency who do the same thing. People have always done that kind of thing by phone. There used to be a lot of efforts to call voters, and it would be just dirty tricks. And I know Senator Monson would certainly probably have stories about that kind of thing. But people would call and tell people, don't make sure you vote on Thursday.
The wrong day.
Make sure you vote next Tuesday when the election was that Tuesday. That kind of thing still happens today. But what the dangerous thing is how much that's moved online. And it's just another reason why people have to be so skeptical of what they see on social media and of what we mentioned earlier, which is considering the source and verifying. If you see something that doesn't look right, if you see something that seems like it may not be true, especially, just double check it with a source that you can trust.
That's right.
I'm so glad Brian talked about the social media and the voter suppression efforts to make just simply think your vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter whether you go or not. Dirty trick. And we see more of it. And, if a person is not inclined to vote to start with, and then they read, well, it doesn't matter. So that certainly is going to keep the likelihood of them staying home is certainly enhanced. So I'm glad you mentioned the phone calls, the emails, the wrong dates. That's common. It happened this election cycle across the U.S. Wrong dates given. It's happened here in Oklahoma. Brian is right. Consider the source. Make sure that it's trusted. It's from a trusted place, and not from some bot somewhere.
Right.
And just keep in mind, they wouldn't work so hard to get you to stay home, to get you to not vote if your vote really didn't matter.
That's right.
That's the thing. They're scared of your vote. People who are trying to suppress your vote know the power of the vote. And that's why they're trying to get you not to vote.
That's a great point. Yes, absolutely. So what should you do if you see some of that activity happening in your community? Who do you turn to say, I just got this phone call and they said election day is December 5th for the presidential election. That can't be right. What should you do? I mean, where can you turn?
Mm-hmm.
Well, anytime that you receive what you feel may be misinformation, like Angela and Brian have both said, you need to verify it through a trusted source.
Mm-hmm.
You can call the Oklahoma State Election Board. You can visit your county election board. But there's always a way to verify any misinformation. And if it sounds wrong, it probably is wrong. So you do just need to be able to go to a reliable source.
It's also important, I think, in cases of voter suppression to report that to someone. And that can be the state election board for one, or your county election board, so that they can get the word out about the correct information. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that when I was at state election board, we really wanted people to let us know when something like that was happening, because we wanted them to be able to go to the media or put things out on social media to say, hey, some folks are getting calls about this. This is not true. Here's the actual correct information. It can also be a good idea to report that to a group like the ACLU. We have a voter hotline. Every major election, they're going to have a voter hotline. You can call that, talk to somebody like me who has some expertise in that issue. And again, we'll be able to check into those things, make sure they're correct, but also try to get the word out, because those private groups can also get the word out. Hey, this stuff's coming out. It's not true. So we just want to make sure that people are getting the correct information. And the best way to do that, let people know who have an extra microphone can get it out to folks so that they have the correct information.
That's right. That's right. And there are a lot of 1-800 numbers on election day in particular. Make sure you're calling the right one. But ACLU is a good source. There are some really good national voting. You think, oh, it's national, they won't reach Oklahoma. But they have contacts right back here in Oklahoma, probably ACLU. But people will look into it. So don't just see it. If, like they said at TSA a long time ago, if you see something, say something.
Absolutely. That's a good way of summarizing it. So how often do we vote in Oklahoma? Andy mentioned before we kicked this off that there's people this week filing for elective office in our for local elections, but everybody kind of nodded and said all the time, but Roxanne, Brian, I think you both can probably share a little bit about really how often elections can be called in this state. Well, the county and city elections vary by county and city. Because in Ardmore, the city officials are elected they have 4-year terms. The county election, they have 4-year terms. Now, the presidential election, of course, is every 4 years. The representatives, when your state representatives, have to be reelected every 2 years. But then they can only serve a total of 12 years. And the senators are the same way. The senators are elected every 4 years, and they can only serve a total of 12 years. So, yeah, like they said, it's constantly happening, and it depends on where you live. We do have city commission elections coming up here soon, this next year. So yeah, it's just, but like we talked about earlier, if you register for your absentee ballot, you won't miss any elections. Mm-hmm. Register for it, and they will automatically send you your absentee ballot. In Oklahoma, you do have to request it every year. In some states, you do not. You will just automatically get an absentee ballot. But in Oklahoma, on January 1st or 2nd, just make it one of the things you have on your calendar to do.
go to the Oklahoma Election Board and automatically sign up for a year's worth of absentee ballots, and you won't miss any elections.
And if people kind of keep in mind that local elections are usually springtime elections in Oklahoma, school board races, city council races, and you're right, filing underway in Oklahoma City right now for school board. And they generally are every year because terms are staggered among members. Every year, every other year, some members' terms expire this year, others will expire next year. So there's this kind of rolling off of members or rolling elections. Of course, the governor can call special elections. The state legislature can set elections. Brian will appreciate this. You know, when elections are called, somebody has to pay for them too. So sometimes cities and counties and school boards are waiting to piggyback on another election so they don't have to pay for that full expense. But primary elections or primaries and runoffs and general elections, virtually for any candidate that could happen if there's more than 2 candidates that filed for office. So we do have a lot of elections in Oklahoma, but that's okay because that's all those are opportunities to exercise our rights as citizens.
So one of the things I had to do whenever I was at the election board was update the list of local elections that were coming up. And I think one of the things people have to keep in mind, you know, most people think of elections, they think of the big elections, the presidential election, the gubernatorial election, which are every 4 years, and they're staggered so that every other year we have a big statewide election. We have a presidential election this year in 2022. We'll elect a governor and we'll elect most of our state officers, various members of Congress. But in those off years, those so-called off years, we actually have more elections in the off years because of the way the calendar works. You can have those local elections every month. You can have an election, except for in December. The law says that only Oklahoma City or Tulsa can call a special election in December. But any other locality in any other county, you can have an election 11 months of the year. In Oklahoma or Tulsa, Oklahoma City or Tulsa, you can have an election all 12 months. There could be an election. Now, in practice, obviously not everyone's going to have an election every month, but somewhere in Oklahoma, someone's voting almost every month in an off year. And even in those on years, again, you're going to have, it's not just that general election. You've got a primary, you've got a runoff. Presidential elections, the presidential primary is a different month than the statewide primary. So you're voting for the presidential primary, and then a month or two later, you're voting for your any state officials who were on that ballot that year. And then you have special elections, and you know, you mentioned Senator Bice, who is now now going to be the U.S. House representative, and they're filling her seat. That election is going to be, in a quote unquote off year. So there are always those unexpired terms that are coming up. And there are just local questions. If a school wants to pass a bond issue, they need to get some funding to build a new, gymnasium. Well, they're going to do that, and it's not going to be necessarily on a presidential election ballot. That's probably going to be here in one of these off years. And that's, again, why I think it's really a good idea to sign up for voting by mail. I also did want to mention, because Senator Monson brought this up, the cost issue, because I want to give a shout out to our state election board and our state election officials and our county election officials, all the way down to our poll workers in this state. We do a really good job here. We avoid a lot of the pitfalls of other states that do things like she mentioned, where they close a polling place in one county or close early voting in one county. In Oklahoma, everything is the same in every county. We're actually the largest state in the nation where our voter system is the same. Everyone's got the same ballots, the same voting machines, and we do a great job. We do a great job of doing things equitably, as far as how everyone's got the same rules. But we do elections here cheaply, and because of that, we have limited days for early voting. That's the single biggest barrier right now for more early voting days is cost. The county election boards in some of the smaller counties, they only have 1.5 full-time employees. They have, the larger counties, they just struggle right now to do early voting as it is. So to extend those days, they would need more staff to do that. And that means more money. So, it's really important when we talk about these things that it goes back to the legislature, and that goes back to voting. So if you want more early voting days, you need to demand that of your candidates when they're running for office and hold them accountable, because as it stands, our election board personnel at both the state and the county level work very hard to put on really good quality, fair elections, and they do a great job of it. And we get great, accurate results. We get them quickly in this state. But the trade-off is we don't necessarily have some of that same access to early voting days as they do in other countries, in other states.
And I'll toot your horn for you, Brian, too. Oklahoma has been a model nationally. You know, the work that I've done nationally, you know, we point to Oklahoma, or others point to Oklahoma. Oklahoma's system of election and balloting as a model to have safe and secure and reasonably accessible elections. So my hat off, and I've worked with many state election board secretaries and our county election board secretary, the last two. They tend to get in those jobs, and they're good jobs, and they're committed servants, and they stay. But I also want to give a shout out to all those poll workers who work for peanuts, literally. And for those young people who are listening, check into being a poll worker. See what it takes, what kind of training, you know, are there things that you can do that would help take the burden off of people who work elections, and they work very, very hard. There may be opportunities that people never knew about, ways to exercise your rights as a citizen and to help enable other people to vote.
Right. Because right now, most of the poll workers are retired women who don't have a job, who have 14 hours to spend at the poll that day. And it's hard to come up with volunteers, especially during COVID. It was a real job to come up with enough people to work the polls this year. So yes, like Angela said, think about volunteering. You do get paid a little bit, but I think actually if they would lower the age where people could work the polls, possibly give them extra credit at school, it would help them actually learn the process, what it takes, you know, from the time someone is handed a ballot to vote until they get it turned back in. You know, whether or not they can ask questions of the poll workers, whether or not they have to mark every box, you know, just questions like that. But it will help prepare them to be educated voters when they get old enough to vote.
The average age of our poll workers in Oklahoma is over 70.
Wow.
And it's a looming crisis, actually, because we're not replacing them as quickly as they are, you know, either retiring or frankly dying off. And the younger generations have just not stepped up to the same rate as our parents and grandparents did. So it is a looming issue where if we don't find a way to increase our poll workers, we're going to have to look at some changes to our system. And all you've got to do to be a poll worker is be a registered voter, and you can volunteer, and they will the county election board will put you through training, and they'll assign you to elections. And it's a great way to see the process. It's a great way to feel like you're making a difference, and it's so crucial. And the counties, the work they do getting enough poll workers is just amazing, especially like Roxanne mentioned during COVID. It's been a real challenge, and they've done a great job, but it is sometimes it feels like it's smoke and mirrors trying to get this stuff done with what we have. And so it's crucially important we have more young people get out and volunteer to be poll workers.
Right.
Well, thank you, all three of you. We have had a wonderful discussion today, and I appreciate all three of your expertise and knowledge around this issue. We are pretty much out of time at this point, but I'm going to throw one last question out there, and I'd like for Angela to answer this question. And we've touched on it a bit already, but does my vote really count? Angela was the one who said earlier today that sometimes elections are decided by as little as a vote or a dozen votes. And that is, we have evidence of that in Oklahoma over the last few years. So Angela, I'd like you to kind of have the last words with, does my vote really count?
Yeah, I just don't want anybody to leave this discussion believing that their vote doesn't count or their vote doesn't matter, because it really does. And here in Oklahoma, historically, historically, you can go check elections that have been decided by a single vote. I remember my first election, I lost, and I'm just going to say honestly, I lost 2 times before I won a race into the state house. But the first election was decided by 132 people. That's not a lot of vote. You know, that's people on a couple of blocks. So votes really do matter. But you know what? Even if an election is run by 12,000 and you say, oh, if I stayed home, it didn't matter. But your vote was a part of that process that lended to that 12,000 difference. So don't ever think it's somebody else's responsibility or it doesn't matter. Your vote counts. Every vote counts, and every vote should be counted. And we're creating a system in this country to make sure that people have safe and accessible means to vote. And legislatures have to, upfront that money. Brian was right. It requires, more than $2 an hour. I don't know what that rate is, but we need to be able to afford and attract people to work at polls. So we got to make the investment. If we make the investment, in turn, we'll get the participation that this state and this country really deserves.
Right.
One.